Supplementary explanation. The Biblical Atonement. A. In the Old Testament, atonement was usually given through the sacrifice of an animal. Exodus chapter 30 verse 10, Leviticus chapter 1 verses 3 to 5, Leviticus chapter 4 verse 20 to 21, Leviticus chapter 16 verses 6 to 22. B. In the New Testament, the concept of the sacrifice of atonement of the Old Testament was basically maintained, but the redemption of all humankind could be fulfilled only by offering the body of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The Apostle Paul said Jesus Christ died for our sins. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 3. The word atonement was not only used to refer to the death of Christ to expiate original sin, but to take away all the sins of all human beings. After the baptism through which the sins of the world were passed on to Jesus, Matthew chapter 3 verse 15, he saved humankind by bleeding on the cross. Leviticus chapter 1 verses 1 to 5, John chapter 19 verse 30. The Apostle Paul explains in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 14 that one died for all. Then, in the following verse 21, he stated it was for us. And again in Galatians chapter 3 verse 13, having become a curse for us. Only a few verses in the New Testament refer to Jesus as the sacrifice. Ephesians chapter 5 verse 2. John chapter 1 verse 29 and 36, Lamb, John the Baptist, and 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 7, our Passover, the Apostle Paul. However, Paul specified that the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan was the atonement for all the sins of the world. He explains in Romans chapter 6 that all the sins of the world were passed on to Jesus through his baptism by John the Baptist. He goes on to explain that the crucifixion of Jesus was the judgment and compensation for sin, and that the sacrifice of atonement was offered for the souls of all people. The death of Jesus was the realization of God's plan, implied in the sacrifice of atonement in the Old Testament. The laying on of hands in the Old Testament and the baptism of Jesus in the New Testament are in accordance with the law of God. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 10, Matthew chapter 3 verses 13 to 17, Hebrews chapter 7 verses 1 to 10 and 18, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 21. The New Testament does not end with the baptism and the death of Jesus, but goes on to tell us that the fulfillment of salvation is our being baptized into Christ, which enables our old selves to die with him. Romans chapter 6 verses 3 to 7, Galatians chapter 2 verses 19 to 20. It tells us that John the Baptist baptized Jesus Christ to take away all the sins of the world, and that as a result he was crucified. Jesus Christ, through his baptism and blood, not only washed away the sins of the world, but also saved us from the power of Satan and returned us to the power of God by accepting punishment and enduring the pain in the place of mankind. Therefore, the redemption of Jesus solved the problem of sin that was blocking people from being close to God. This momentous event restored peace and harmony between people and God, bringing salvation, joy, Romans chapter 5 verse 11, life, Romans chapter 5 verse 17 to 18, and redemption, Matthew chapter 3 verse 15, John chapter 1 verse 29, Hebrews chapter 10 verses 1 to 20, Ephesians chapter 1 verse 7, Colossians chapter 1 verse 14 at the same time.